In October 1929, the newsreel camera captured the first federal Labor government for 15 years. The smiling Prime Minister was James Scullin, but the architect of victory was the Treasurer, Ted Theodore. Within days of these pictures being taken, Scullin and Theodore would confront the worst economic crisis of this century. It would destroy Ted Theodore's political career, but it would shape economic policy for decades to come.
Under the stars above, for I'm an unemployed sweetheart looking for somebody to love. I'll guarantee I can spoon right, just like a turtle dove, for I'm an unemployed sweetheart looking for somebody to love. Now I've got kisses and I've got arms, still I'm always blue, 'cause my kisses and my arms have no work to do. If I got a chance in the moonlight, I wouldn't need a shove, for I'm an unemployed sweetheart looking for somebody to love.
All the time I was at high school, my father, who was a steel worker, was out of work. And I could see the abuse and calumny that was heaped on his head, and I knew he was a decent father and that he was able and willing to work, but he just couldn't get any, and I could never figure this out. So when I left school and after the war went to university, I decided to go to university to study economics, really to try to get an answer to that question as to why the system broke down.
The foundation stone of Australia's depression was laid in the 1920s. By world standards, Australia had a small boom. Soldiers returned to a decade of unemployment over 8% and an economy that was at the mercy of the international market for primary products.
Work out. How much is 700 bushels of wheat at 6 shillings a bushel, Dave?
What did you say? 700 bags?
Bushels, B-U-S-L-S, bushels. 6 shillings a bushel.
Wheat was it, Dad?
Wheat, yeah, W-W-E-T-E, wheat.
At 6 shillings a bushel.
A bushel.
Oh, I've never done it at A. I've always done it at per.
Well, get a move on and per it.
A strong overseas market for wheat and wool enabled Australia to meet the interest on loans readily available from London and New York. Good seasons, high prices, and borrowed money masked the coming crisis.
And we had grown accustomed to steady government borrowing right through the 20s. There was a big period of expansion in that period. Public works for this, setting up infrastructure for cities and for transport and for newer industries and things like that.
Even the nation's brand new capital city was built on borrowed money. As the Duke of York opened Parliament House in 1927, export prices fell, putting a question mark against Australia's capacity to repay loans. The national debt had grown to record levels under the Conservative Prime Minister Stanley Bruce.
Bruce was
more English than the English. He dressed like an Englishman, striped pants, spats, little white coverings over the shoes, white suede, I suppose, buckled underneath. I don't know what their function was supposed to be.
Pull up your underpants.
Oh, they ain't underpants. They're spats.
Labor had been in the federal wilderness since the conscription split of the First World War. In hope of new direction, they turned to the strong man of Queensland politics, Ted Theodore. The son of a hard-working Irish woman and a Romanian sailor, Theodore left school during the Depression of the 1890s to try his luck on the goldfields of Western Australia. In 1906, he joined the rush to North Queensland. Riding his bike between mining camps, railway gangs and two-up joints, he organised a union. Within 3 years, he was a member of State Parliament.
And there was an election meeting there, and Theodore was addressing the multitude, and a group of fellows who were going to smash up the meeting, and 3 of them got onto the platform where Theodore was speaking. And he was a big, strong fellow, Theodore, and he grabbed the 3 of them, and he hustled the 3 of them off the platform there, single-handed. He was a fellow about, I'd say, nearly 6 feet, but a tough, hard, broad, thick-set, strong-looking character.
When I was about 7 at school, one of my little schoolmates said, my father's a policeman, see, and I'll tell on you, see, my father's a policeman. And I didn't know what my father did, and sometime later, I mentioned it to my father, and he roared with laughter. He said, well, you could have said to her, well, my father is in charge of all policemen, and I'll tell on you, see? And I said, well, how can you do that? And he said, well, I'm Premier of Queensland.
By 1919, the 34-year-old Theodore was Queensland Premier. When he resigned to enter federal politics 6 years later, he was a wealthy man. He played the stock market and carried a silver-top cane. In 1927, he moved to Sydney and paid £8,000 for a mansion in Kirribilli. The communists, who he tried to drive out of the Labor Party, called him Kirribilli Ted. Conservative journalists dubbed him Red Ted. Across the harbour from Theodore's Kirribilli home lay his federal electorate, centred on the narrow streets and workers' cottages of the Balmain docklands.
And I thought he was the best type of politician I'd met, because he wasn't interested in just cultivating votes for himself. He was a man with a mission, a man with a policy. Development of Australia, development of Australian industry, development of Australia as an independent nation.
Prime Minister Bruce saw Theodore as a threat and set up a royal commission into allegations that Theodore had paid the sitting Labor member £8,000 to resign. Theodore was found not guilty, but it was rumoured that his friend John Wren, the Melbourne SP bookmaker millionaire, had organised the cash. From the opposition front bench, Theodore led the attack on Bruce's economic management. Bruce blamed the workers' high wages and low productivity for Australia's falling export income.
In 1928, they're putting up the same solution to the economic problems they're putting up today. The donkey must work hard and eat less chaff and carry more sticks, then he's better off.
Fortnight after my 14th birthday, down a bloody coal mine, not on day shift either, but on afternoon shift. I was bloody terrified on my low candle power lamp. 14-year-old, I saw ghosts, goblins, witches, anything supernatural you mentioned, I saw it.
Bruce's hard line provoked major disputes. On the Melbourne docks, wharfies rejected what they called the Dog Collar Act and began a 10-month strike.
There was an attack made on the scabs. We had some of them in the water. And we were making an exchange of some of our people off the police for the scabs. And actually we were walking away from the contest. There'd been a bloody contest on. We'd been getting into the coppers and the coppers been getting into us. What was his name? Cooper, I think, the coppers in charge of him. He deliberately said, lower your guns and fire. Yeah. Nagel was hit in the back, so was Whittaker.
When 12,000 miners were locked out of Hunter Valley coal mines for refusing a 12.5% pay cut, Bruce's industrial policy split his government.
The Federal Labour Party, of which I have the honour to be deputy leader, is appealing to the people of Australia in what is probably the most momentous election campaign in the history of the Commonwealth. Throughout the length and breadth of Australia, there has for months past been a clamour for a lowering of the costs of production. When large employing interests speak of lowering the cost of production, they mean only one thing, a reduction of wages and a lengthening of hours. To safeguard their wages and conditions, therefore, the workers should return the Labour Party to power.
We're in the money, we're in the money. We've got a lot of what it takes to get along. We're in the money, the skies are sunny. Old man depression, you are through, you done us wrong.
In Labor's landslide lower house victory, Bruce lost his seat and retired to England. Hopes were high that the new Labor government would make long-promised reforms. James Scullin from Richmond in Melbourne was Australia's first Catholic Prime Minister.
Scullin was a charmer, honourable, nice, trustworthy, absolute gentleman, scholar, all the things that make for a bad politician.
Ted Theodore was the Treasurer and Chief Policy Maker of the government. Conservatives feared him because of his actions in Queensland. He'd led the fight against conscription, abolished the upper house, and was the first Australian politician to borrow money outside England.
Theodore, from the very beginning, was a marked man. He was the only member of that whole Scullin government who had any sense of economics. He knew all the tricks of the game. He could beat them at their own game.
Theodore said Australia should be more than a sheep farm and was determined to expand local manufacturing.
He used to have his suits made from Australian woven material, yarrow balls woven material, and they were like cardboard. They'd stand up on their own. His colleagues would rib him about these awful, they'd feel and say, oh, Ted, what are you doing wearing that awful material? And he'd say, well, you should all be doing this too, but aren't we trying to promote Australian-made goods?
Only days after the Labor government was sworn in, $26 billion was wiped off share values on the New York Exchange. Business confidence collapsed. It was now impossible for Australia to borrow money overseas. Theodore hurried to his Treasury office to find the legacy of the Bruce government, a massive budget deficit. At the first cabinet meeting, he spelt out the problem. Australia depended on borrowed money and high export prices to meet interest repayments overseas. But export prices were plummeting. Wheat was down from 6 shillings to 1 shilling and 8pence a bushel. Australia couldn't earn the income to pay its debts. the reform agenda was shelved. Theodore increased tariffs and took the orthodox steps of raising taxes and slashing expenditure.
It's obvious that we had to reduce standards of living in Australia. We were no longer producing the wherewithal to provide people with the standards of living that they'd enjoyed in the past, and no one would lend to us from overseas. On this occasion, of course, on the occasion of this depression, which we're in the middle of now, the same sort of thing was true. Standards of living would have had to be reduced in Australia if it had not been for the fact that we're now able to borrow $16 billion a year from overseas, and that is enabling Australia to maintain its standards of living. But we couldn't do that in 1929.
Well, the fact is, Tedworth, that circumstances compel us to make certain cuts in our expenses. Well, if we give you a month's notice, you leave about the 20th.
The actual action that was taken was the action to meet the financial crises, sacking a lot of people in order to reduce expenditure, so that in that way they could meet their loans, and this action, of course, probably made the recession worse.
And I can always remember my father and the men coming home singing, "Work, boys, work and be contented as long as you've enough to earn a crust." Very bitter they were, very angry men. A very angry time, indeed, during the Depression.
Unemployment rose 5% during Labor's first 6 months in office.
We are passing through a period of depression. Large numbers of our people are unemployed. Large percentage are out of work. The Australian government that has just come into power, the Australian Labor government, is faced with many difficulties, many serious problems. And our first problem is to provide work for the workless in Australia.
Most people were bemused and sort of wandering around in a confused state. Like the man who tapped me on the shoulder seriously and said, "Are we going to get out of this?"
Pressure. Don't you understand? Why, this slump is likely to last for years. No work today or tomorrow.
The meanest labourer I employ is twice the man that you are.
Things are bad, old man. Damn bad.
In those days, the Depression was more like a natural event, like a flood or an earthquake. No one really understood that it had causes. It had just happened. So what can you do about a flood or an earthquake? Not much.
There doesn't seem to be any quiet, easy period of sunshine for any of the great European and American nations. We're all under the pressure of events. The whole world is under pressure.
They thought the Depression should never occur, should never happen. So what you had to do is more of the same. Reduce costs, reduce wages, reduce government expenditure, reduce deficits. In other words, tighten everything up, which of course made it worse.
With unemployment accelerating, Theodore argued that it was futile to wait for world recovery. The government had to find its own solution.
Government was getting either no advice on these issues or pretty orthodox advice. And as for economists in the Treasury, there were none.
In 1930, monetary policy was in the hands of the orthodox businessmen of the Commonwealth Bank Board. Theodore introduced a bill to establish a separate reserve bank and give the government a greater say. Money should be a servant, he said, not a master. Through a reserve bank, the government could influence the volume of money in circulation.
Theodore saw that money was created by the banking system and that as the quantity of exchange business rose, so did the quantity of money rise. Now, when the business began to decline, the quantity of money began to decline. The banks had a controlling power in money, and Theodore saw this was one of the vital factors in determining what we would call now the level of activity, the level of employment, whether we've got booms or whether we've got recessions and depressions.
The chairman of the Commonwealth Bank, Sir Robert Gibson, believed any increase in the volume of money would debase the currency. Theodore's Reserve Bank bill outraged the banks. They said the level of activity was for banks to determine, not government. The Conservative-dominated Senate agreed, and the bill was consigned to the limbo of a select committee.
Things were extraordinarily cheap. If you had 10 shillings in your pocket, which I seldom had, you could take a girl out, say on Saturday night. You bought her a small box of old gold chocolates for a shilling. You bought a packet of 12 Capstan cigarettes for 6 cents. Things were cheap if you, if you had any sort of a job.
But as the level of activity continued to drop, unemployment broke through 15%. Scullin prepared to leave for a British Empire conference in London, and it was announced that Theodore would be acting Prime Minister. Four days before Theodore could bring down the 1930 budget, a Queensland Royal Commission found him guilty of corruption. In 1922, during Theodore's premiership, the Queensland government bought mines at Mungana to supply the Chillago smelters. This was part of Queensland Labor's program of state enterprise. They ran bakeries, butcher shops, cattle stations and pubs. The Royal Commission, appointed by a now Conservative Queensland government, found that Theodore had been a secret shareholder in Mungana mines. The Bank of New South Wales provided the newspapers with cheques made out to Theodore many years earlier.
Mungana's a very fine word for political reasons, if you think about it. You pay some mindless heckler to go to a meeting, and all he has to do is shout, "What about Mungana?" It's a beautiful word politically, and it was used to the last drop of blood they could get out of it.
Theodore was forced to stand down as treasurer, pending a trial. The banks were now firmly in control of the economy.
This is the first chance I've had to talk to you, and I'm coming straight to the point. What is the farmer's best friend? The bank. Quite right, but not the bank that you mean. There's one bank that never charges interest. Lead me to it, Dad. I will. The River Bank.
In July 1930, a week after Theodore resigned, the Bank of England's economic mission arrived in Australia. Their leader was Sir Otto Niemeyer.
He called a spade, and he didn't think much of our spades in Australia. So that he spoke pretty brutally to the premiers and to the Commonwealth Government.
After looking over the state and Commonwealth accounts, Niemeyer prescribed his remedy. Governments, he said, must follow the principles of sound finance, stop borrowing, reduce expenditure and balance budgets. Niemeyer had been invited by the chairman of the Commonwealth Bank, Sir Robert Gibson. Gibson insisted that the state and federal governments accept the Bank of England's terms. Only then, he said, could Australia meet its overseas debts and maintain its credit rating. The state premiers and acting Treasurer Lyons pledged to balance their budgets by the end of the financial year. In caucus, Theodore questioned Niemeyer's prescription and began to mobilise support for a solution that would put unemployment first.
Theodore, of course, was a great reader. Even when we went to a Labor picnic, he spent his time mostly reading a book. And I remember having a look at the book, and it was a book on some economic matter or financial matters. He was a self-educated man. So he kept himself up to date all the time on, you know, the latest economic theories and the opinions of economic writers.
At the same time, Theodore campaigned for a trial in Queensland to clear his name.
As far as everybody else was concerned, he was a guilty man, you see. But there was absolutely no change in his demeanour or the routine of the house or the routine of his getting up in the morning and polishing his shoes out on the balcony, looking out over the harbour and ruminating on what the day's events would be, and then off to the Commonwealth Bank where his offices were. Came home, had his meal as usual at 6 o'clock and went to bed early if he wasn't in the study doing some work. And as soon as his head hit the pillow, you could hear his snores.
When Theodore had moved to Sydney, he stepped onto the turf of the big fella of New South Wales Labor, Jack Lang.
Jack Lang regarded Theodore as a political rival, something I could never understand. Theodore didn't criticise him. Theodore didn't want to run the New South Wales Labor Party. But Lang turned on Theodore, and I remember the organising secretary saying to the party, these two will fight it out. I think that was Lang's idea.
In October 1930, Jack Lang regained the New South Wales Premiership by rejecting the belt tightening of the other premiers.
Boy, he was a spellbinder. He had a rasping, snarly sort of a voice, and there were no amplifiers in those days. I was within, say, a couple of 100 yards of him, and he said, I'm determined that the babies of Balmain will not suffer at the hand of blood-sucking bandits like Niemeyer from the Bank of England, that sort of thing. He was a frightening speaker. He was the sort of bloke that he snarled at everything. Yeah. The bloodsuckers of Britain, he used to say.
Private enterprise collapsed. Threw them out onto the street unemployed. Their bosses didn't want them. They could starve, they could perish.
As politicians and financiers searched for a solution, unemployment continued to rise. By Christmas 1930, it had gone up another 5% to 20%.
You are just a lonely battler and you're waiting for a rattler, and you wish to heaven you were never born. For you ran to dodge a copper and you came an awful cropper, and the skin on both your hands is cut and torn. You are tired and you are weary, lack of sleep makes your eyes bleary, the soles of both your shoes are worn right through. Your heart is sore and aching, and your back is nearly breaking, your coat and shirt and pants have had it too.
When you were travelling south, there was a ration ticket that you got. So much for bread, and so much for meat, and so much for groceries, and the total was a little over 5 shillings. You got that once a week. But you had to travel a certain distance from the last place you got it to the next place before you'd get it. If you didn't do that, you didn't get it. And when they got you down to the Queensland border, the New South Wales authorities were trying to keep you back, and the Queensland ones were trying to push you over. And once you got over the border, the Queensland mob didn't want you back again. So it was quite a battle.
In 1930, there was no federal dole, only state government food relief. If anyone in a household had a job, no one else in the house could claim unemployment relief. And to be eligible for a ration ticket, you had to satisfy the dole inspector that you had spent all your savings, sold any valuables, and been out of work for 6 months. Many had to turn to charities.
Those who are forced to live upon government relief allowances, who pay high rent, who try unsuccessfully to follow the high cost of living, find the mission's evening distribution of food a great boon. The mission realizes that hungry men are dangerous men.
Since Theodore's resignation, the government had drifted, incapable of decisive action. Joe Lyons, the acting treasurer, supported Niemeyer's call to balance the budget by cutting wages, salaries and pensions. But he failed to persuade caucus that classical economics held the answer to the crisis.
Classical economists were supply-side economics. They looked only at costs of production, getting costs down, with all that involved, as the main way to prosperity, the supply side. That is classical economics. That is economic rationalism as it has come back now.
The Great Depression was a boom time for economists. Economics was in the spotlight as never before.
We have nothing to fear.
From Cambridge, John Maynard Keynes challenged the orthodox fixation with the supply side.
It said the main thing in prosperity is effective demand for goods and services that are produced down there on the supply side. Unless you have enough effective demand, they won't function on the supply side, no matter how low they can get their costs. Because the lower they get their costs, the less effective demand there will be. Because costs become income, income becomes spent in effective demand, and if you cut your costs down very low, you'll be cutting effective demand as well. So you can't make business prosperous unless it can sell its stuff.
The first copy of Keynes's Treatise on Money to reach Australia was flown out for Ted Theodore. From the backbench, Theodore put forward a Keynesian plan for Australia's recovery. He agreed that national income had shrunk dramatically, but pointed to the impact of orthodox cost-cutting, industry paralysed, business confidence shattered, and unemployment spiralling. The free market had failed to meet people's needs. It was time for bold government intervention, he said. Attack unemployment first by stimulating the economy through controlled credit expansion. Since Labor had won office, unemployment had risen by 1% every month. Throughout the country, demonstrations broke out against the grudging food relief and in support of paid public works. When Prime Minister Scullin returned in January 1931, he faced a nation demanding action.
My father came back from overseas. He had been attending the Imperial Conference with the Prime Minister, and I remember they drove us from the Hotel Windsor to the Richmond Town Hall, and that was when I first heard the sound of breaking glass. The glass was in the car. My mother was petrified. She was always a very nervous soul. But I do remember the angry faces at the window of the car.
My message to the people of Australia today is this. No matter what you may read or what you may hear, I ask you to believe me that the government of Australia will do nothing to ruin Australia or run it over the precipice. I ask that you will have confidence in your government, that you will have confidence in your nation, and that you will have confidence in yourself.
Scullin stunned the Parliament by reappointing Theodore as Treasurer, even though the Mungana trial had not begun. Joe Lyons resigned in protest. The cornerstone of Theodore's recovery plan was an £18 million fiduciary note issue, injecting credit into the economy for public works and assistance to the stricken wheat farmers. The press and the banks condemned the fiduciary note issue as a one-way ticket to inflation and warned that Australia's currency would become valueless.
People became hysterical, of course, once it was suggested that notes would be printed to finance the public works. And they thought that if you once started to inflate, if you once started to use bank notes, if you once started to use central bank credit, then everybody would be ruined by the rapid rise in prices that would follow from that. There was real hysteria.
As 1931 dawned, it was clear that no Australian government could meet the Bank of England's terms and balance its budget by June. Theodore presented his plan at a crisis meeting with state premiers, including Jack Lang. Theodore argued that inflation could be controlled, and while cuts would have to be made, credit was the key to putting the nation to work. With the premiers poised to accept the plan, Jack Lang called for an adjournment. When the conference resumed, Lang branded Theodore a banker's man and tabled his own plan, 3 sentences long. Lang said that if interest repayments to British bondholders were suspended, Australia's standard of living could be maintained.
Now Premier Lang for us will fight, we've got to see him through. Our motto clear is Lang is right, and don't we know it too?
The Lang plan gripped the imagination of the unemployed and lowly paid workers overnight. The New South Wales and federal Labor parties split, and Lang formed his own federal party. New South Wales, he said, would go it alone.
So give 3 cheers for Premier Lang and good old New South Wales.
The other premiers rejected Lang's plan and commissioned Theodore to negotiate with the banks for credit. In 1931, 1 million people, 1/6 of the population, had no income at all. Tens of thousands had no money to pay the rent. Evictions were commonplace.
The conditions of an eviction fight was 30 days from the court order. And they could only evict you from sun up to sunset. On the 30th day usually was the day they emptied people out, because we used to pack the joint on that day with unemployed. Well, of course there was rations.
The Senate and the banks paid no heed to the clamour in the cities. The Conservative Senate rejected Theodore's fiduciary notes bill, and the Commonwealth and private banks refused to provide credit. Sir Robert Gibson delivered an ultimatum to the state and federal governments: make the cuts to salaries, wages and pensions, or the Commonwealth Bank would stop the money supply. With the battle of the plans at a stalemate, professional economists entered the field of national policy for the first time.
I was asked by the Commonwealth Bank to come along as an economist. As their first economist, they didn't have one before that.
Leslie Melville joined a team of academic economists commissioned by the state premiers to present a plan to meet the financial crisis at a special premiers conference in June 1931.
The governments of the Commonwealth and of the states have been gathered together during the last 3 weeks to evolve a plan to meet the serious financial position confronting Australia. That plan has now been worked out.
We sat in considerable doubt as to what would happen when this plan was taken to Theodore, and we were incredibly pleased and perhaps astounded when Sheehan brought back the word that he was going to accept it.
Nearly everyone is affected in some way or other in the measures adopted under the Premier's Conference Rehabilitation Plan. Some are affected by suffering a reduction in interest or in other income, some by reduction in wages or pensions or salaries, some by increased taxation. Not anybody escapes from the general sacrifice.
The Premier's plan cut wages and salaries by 20%. Taxes increased, and old age pensions dropped 12.5%. The only concession won by Theodore was a 22.5% cut in interest paid to Australian bondholders.
The holders of the bonds and government securities generally, by making their contribution, will be helping Australia in this hour of trial, and will be helping their fellow citizens, many of whom are suffering great hardship and distress.
Returns to British bondholders were not cut. Theodore had accepted the poison chalice. As Treasurer, he was responsible for the greatest reduction in expenditure in Australia's history.
Gibson had said that the Commonwealth Bank would not honour his cheques beyond a certain point, and that would have brought him to the position where he wouldn't have had finance to pay public servants. And he had nowhere to go. He really had to accept the Premier's plan.
The battle of the plans was over, and Theodore had lost. The Premier's plan was a victory for orthodox economists and banks, and had no trouble passing through the Senate. The cuts reduced the level of activity in the economy even further, causing more bankruptcies and redundancies. Unemployment reached 27%. The country began to splinter. Fringe organisations grew on the left and the right. Even the Conservative Nationalist Party was disintegrating. In New South Wales, fear of Lang's policies caused a run on the State Savings Bank, closing its doors. Sir Robert Gibson delayed Commonwealth Bank support to teach the electorate the perils of government interference in the banking system.
Hey, Mum, would you mind if I tossed the towel in and gave Webster best?
Whatever you do, Dad, will be right with me. Of course, I would have felt proud going to church with you on Sunday. The new member's wife and all that. And everybody looking. But what should an old woman like me want with pride? Except what she has in her man and her children.
I'll rub it in.
Well, your friends will be sorry. Why should you care if they say you ratted on the party?
Ratted on the party?
Sit down, Dad. I haven't finished with you yet.
Ratted on the party? Me, ratted.
Joe Lyons was persuaded by a group of Melbourne businessmen to desert Labor and lead the Nationalists under a new name, the United Australia Party. 5 former Labor members joined him. The balance of power lay with the Lang faction. In November, the 5 Lang followers accused Theodore of pork barrelling in his Balmain electorate and voted with the opposition to bring the government down.
Now, this election has come very suddenly upon everyone. I can give you no better advice than to tune in with Britain. Trust the United Australia Party as the British people trusted the United British Party. Do as Britain did. The mad financial schemes and irresponsible actions of Mr. Lang smashed the great savings bank of New South Wales. I ask you, do you propose to give to Mr. Theodore, with his equally mad financial schemes, an opportunity to smash the whole banking system in Australia?
The only good news for Ted Theodore in 1931 was his acquittal in the long-delayed Mungana trial in Brisbane. 6,000 people cheered as he left the court, but his reputation was smeared forever.
He was standing on the back of a lorry, and it was a very, very volatile meeting, and then men were lurching out of the local pub and heckling him, but he could handle hecklers. It upset me, and I said to him afterwards, I must have been about 14, I think. I said, what were those people trying to do to you? And he said, oh, it's politics. But I said, what were they throwing things at you for? He was pretty good at ducking. But he said, oh, that's politics. He said, and anybody who goes in for politics without broad shoulders, Myra, is in the wrong job. He said, I can take it, don't worry, it's all right.
In the landslide that annihilated the Scullin government, Ted Theodore lost his seat to a Lang candidate. It was the end of his political career. Lang's party won only 3 seats. Lyons, the new Prime Minister, made it illegal for New South Wales to default on overseas loans. 2 months after opening the Sydney Harbour Bridge, Lang was sacked by the New South Wales Governor for defying the new federal law. He was never Premier again, but Labor remained split for a decade. Joe Lyons was to be Prime Minister throughout the 1930s. His government stuck to the Premier's plan, trusting in market forces to pull Australia out of depression. The predicted rise in investor confidence failed to eventuate. By 1933, 1 in every 3 Australian workers was out of a job.
We're then starting to organise the unemployed workers movement. We always organised demonstrations in the city. We always got bashings until we reorganised it to a Friday night demonstration when there was a shopping night and mixed go through Myers and big stores and have a march through there. And it was very difficult to for the police to use the batons. Myers wasn't happy because some of the boys were picking up things as they went through, which was okay as far as we were concerned anyhow.
Organised by the Communist Party, the unemployed workers movement campaigned against evictions and for a money dole. They forced governments to introduce paid relief work.
So he took his insults in silence, for this was the period when we lived in the Great Depression and nothing was cheaper than men. And we drove the shovels and swung the picks and cursed the choking dust. We'd wives and hungry kids to feed, so toil in the heat we must. And as the sun...
When my father got relief work, and my mother would do everything she could because he was the working man. Somehow or other she got some bacon, and I can remember my father sitting down to breakfast and there was eggs and bacon, and he said, Millie, I can't eat this, with the children looking on. So my mother said, children, go outside while your father has his breakfast.
I was aware there was a depression, naturally, mainly because we had unemployed men coming to the door every day. And one morning I remember my father was up on the balcony as usual, and he spotted a vagrant asleep on the grass. My father just put his hand in his pocket and said, "Here, find yourself a bed somewhere else tonight. But don't tell all your mates, otherwise we'll have everybody lining up, sleeping on the lawn overnight. Don't tell anybody else."
For Ted Theodore, the end of politics was the making of his fortune. He had no trouble borrowing money to finance his own business. With Frank Packer, he founded the Women's Weekly and Consolidated Press. And with a consortium including John Wren, he struck it rich with Fiji gold. At the mines, he lived in a native hut and was made a chief, Ratu Edward. For most Australians, the 30s were wasted years, while they waited for world recovery to bring them work and a living wage.
We were working on the stone quarry as relief workers one winter's morning. About 9 o'clock in the morning, we saw men beginning to come through the town. We recognised them as workers from Pillarmain Colliery. Pillarmain miner had been killed. And we all swung round and looked at Bluey Pearce, who was working on relief work with us. He was the next man to go back into Pillarmain. And he'd go back because another man had been killed. That was the type of situation that we were involved in. You gained by somebody else dying.
Well, we didn't rely on market economics in order to pay for the war.
The full cabinet today directed the war cabinet to gazette the necessary regulations for the complete mobilization of all the resources, money, machinery, buildings, plants, whatever it may be.
In 1941, John Curtin's Labor government took control of the Australian economy. Everything was directed to the war effort. Taxation, forced savings, internal and external borrowing, rationing, price controls to stop inflation, and credit from the Commonwealth Bank.
Here was a job for bushman, carrier, wharfie, carpenter, welder, painter, engineer and clerk. A job for the mines, the mills and the foundries. And everything had to be quick.
With the outbreak of war, an endless stream of money poured into public works, creating a job for every man and woman able to work. Unemployment disappeared in Australia. The Great Depression was over. Theodore returned to public life in 1942 to set up the Allied Works Council. As director, Red Ted spent £1 million a week on public works. With victory in sight, he retired to Fiji. A serious heart condition forced him to return to Sydney in 1949.
We weren't a demonstrative family, but that day I had lost control. I just went over and put my arms around him and laid my cheek against his and didn't say anything. I hugged him. And then I had a barrier on my head and he took it off and he started to twirl it around. I thought, oh, what's the matter? What's going on? His mind's going. I was very perturbed. But he was just playing for time, I think, because he said to me, Myra, I only have 3 days left. I'll be gone in 3 days. In 3 days, he was gone.
Theodore died in 1950. He was 65. 20 years earlier, he'd been vilified for supporting Keynes. But depression and war changed the views of economists and government. Full employment was now the goal of government economic policy.
People had just emerged from what was really 10 years of depression, because the depression started in 29 and went on till 39. So, and they were saying, never again, we aren't going to have that. We have to have a society in which we put employment right at the top of the ladder. In order to do that, you have to control the financial system. Now, that situation of controlling finance and controlling exchange rates really lasted until the 1970s. It lasted, for quarter of a century, and that was the most prosperous period of world capitalism. And then around about that time, the financiers won out, and the banks began to be deregulated, and pressure began to deregulate exchange, and we've gone backwards since then in many ways. And this, to me, is a lesson that comes out of Theodore and Keynes particularly, that you have to be able to control the power of finance if you are going to have a decent, fair, humane, just economic system which provides full employment for people, or anything close to it.
When your hair has turned to silver, I'll still be on the dole. I will live in Happy Valley, where the Reds have got control. I will draw the weekly ration and the child endowment too. And when I get the old age pension, I'll leave the rest to you.
They were too young to die. Their love for each other was greater than the political hate which tore their country apart. They were a real-life Romeo and Juliet, attempting to live and love in war-torn Sarajevo. Join us for next week's ABC special, Romeo and Juliet in Sarajevo, the story of the Bosnian conflict through the lives and deaths of two young people, next Wednesday at 8:30. Coming up, Sunset Boulevard, right after a news update.